Good afternoon. My name is Dr. Amy Alonestein, and I am so pleased to see so many of you here today for our Gettysburg Symposium lecture. On behalf of my colleague in the Prescott Campus History Department, Professor Debbie Roberts, I welcome you to this second session of the Gettysburg Symposium. A little more than a year ago, Debbie and I were asked to organize some kind of celebration to honor the 150th anniversary of the Battle of Gettysburg. Debbie and I decided that we would much rather honor the powerful words of the Gettysburg Address, which followed approximately 3 months later, than the heartbreaking 3-day battle, which 4 of us watched last night. We wanted this celebration to be educational. These symposium lectures provided this week will not only recognize our nation's history, but will illustrate for our community the diversity and scholarly wealth of the Yavapai College faculty. Our faculty used the Gettysburg Address as a point of origin to demonstrate the vitality and the complexity of their respective disciplines. In addition to our lecture series, the Performing Arts Center presents films and a live performance by Bobby Horton, which will be tomorrow night. Bobby Horton is tomorrow night. Tonight's film is Glory. I think it's only about 2 hours. I welcome you today and hope that you will take advantage of our lectures Thursday and Friday as well, and we will also have 2 concluding sessions on the Prescott campus over the weekend. Today, it is my honor to introduce Dr. Matt Pearcy, who shall speak to you on infectious diseases during the Civil War. And just a reminder, the movie tonight is Glory. Mingus Union High School students will have the sign-in sheet for you available on the way out as well if you came in a little late. So thank you very much. Matt?
So when I look out here at this crowd, I see pretty much every generation of Americans represented, and it looks like no matter which generation you're in, one thing's the same. Nobody ever wants to sit in the front row, just like my regular classes. So thank you for being here today. This was a really interesting project for me to take on because I spent a lot of my life studying infectious diseases and trying to make better vaccines for them. So the goal was always to know the latest little tidbit of information that could make them work better or somehow improve them for people. And we never, in my course of study or when I was working in that field, ever took a second to look back at what things used to be like for people a long time ago. And a long time ago is not really that long ago. So it was really interesting for me to do this. So thank you for coming and thank you for giving me the opportunity to. Can you guys hear me okay? Can you hear the echo that I hear? I feel like I should be singing Madonna songs anyway with this getup, but we'll stick with it. Okay, so to talk about infectious disease during the Civil War, what we're going to do is start out by talking just a little bit about the Civil War in general, who fought pretty much. And then we're going to talk about the time period that the Civil War took place in. If you want to understand why there was so much carnage and so much death in the Civil War, you really need to understand where different scientific fields were at during that time. Some fields were really advanced. We were really good at killing. Some fields, like the medical field, were in the dark ages. We basically couldn't help anybody. So we'll talk about the time period, and then I'm going to show you a whole litany of pictures and diseases people got during the war, either from just living in an area, getting wounded, or also little sexually transmitted diseases too. All those took an enormous toll on people. Okay, so why did the Civil War happen? I'm sure people could have several presentations on that topic. There's a lot of controversy with that. Basically, the North and the South in general disagreed on a few things, like tariffs with Europe and otherwise. They disagreed on the topic of slavery. The people sitting in the front row, welcome, okay? And lastly, they fought a lot about states' rights versus federal rights. So all those things kind of came together. The states disagreed in general. The North didn't agree with the South and vice versa. And then when Lincoln was elected in 1860, that was kind of the last straw for the South. states started seceding. In the end, 11 of them left the Union, and then in April of 1861, the Confederacy, or the South, started firing cannonballs at Fort Sumter, and then it was on, right? And so for the next few years, the two fought until finally in 1885, the South, or the Confederacy, surrendered, okay? So what is the North and what is the South? If you look at this map of the United States, this shows America as we see it nowadays, right? So all the states down here in this color, I'm colorblind, so I have no idea what it is, but all these states, these were in the South, okay? All the blue states, those made up the North. Some of those states became part of the Union during the Civil War, like Nevada and also West Virginia. These states here in this light color, those were states that didn't secede from the Union, but they allowed slavery. So the white states didn't exist back then. So they hadn't become official states of the United States yet. So those were, geographically, this is going to delineate who was the South and who was the North. Now, as I'm sure people know, just because you belong to a certain state doesn't mean you fought for that state. That's why people say brother against brother and all that, because people could leave and go to whichever side they believed in and fight there. Okay? So those were the players. So if you want to look at the number of people who fought in that war, that's shown up here. So the North, they had about 2.1 million people. Okay? That's how many soldiers they had fighting for them. The Confederacy had a little bit over 1 million. So the Union, or the North, outnumbered the South, or the Confederacy, about 2 to 1. Okay. One reason we talk about the Civil War so much is because of the absolute carnage that it caused. So this number right here, 620,000, this has long been accepted to be roughly the number of American soldiers who died during the Civil War. Okay? So this is actually an interesting number. I found during research that in the last few years, a lot of the census records from the South have been digitized. So historians who are interested in that kind of thing can mine that data and find a little more accurately how many people actually died. And it looks like nowadays more like 750,000 people actually were killed, soldiers were killed in the Civil War. Okay? So if we put that in context, that's why I like this figure here. This tells you how many American soldiers were killed in the rest of the American wars. So in World War II, we lost 405,000. In World War I, we lost 116,000 soldiers, so on and so forth. Now, if you take the time to add all these up, if you add up all the soldiers that died in every war we've ever had except for the Civil War, it's about 640,000. So it's pretty close to say that half the American soldiers that ever died during a war died in the Civil War. So there was a lot of death, a lot of destruction. So this topic is supposed to be about infectious disease. Is this guy ever going to get to the point? If you look at this, this is a large number of people who died, the 620,000. But if you look at what those people actually died of, 2 out of 3 actually died from infectious diseases. So if you do the math, that means about 410,000 of those people didn't die from being shot and being killed immediately from their wounds. They died from an infectious disease somewhere along the way. So 2/3 of them. So the question you have to think about next is, where did these infectious diseases come from? How could a soldier going about his everyday business contract an infectious disease? So if we look at this, there are 3 major ways that a soldier could come in contact with an infectious disease. One was just from the environment. We'll talk more about this. People are moving around. They're going to new environments they've never been to before. They're exposed to diseases their immune systems had never seen. Sexually transmitted diseases were a huge problem during the war. We'll talk about that. And then the last one is probably the most obvious. If you were shot but not killed immediately, then you could die from an infection resulting from that wounding. So these are the 3 major routes where a soldier could come in contact with an infectious disease. And we're going to come back to each one of these specifically. But to talk about why that last number, that 410,000, was so high, compared to every other war, the next thing we need to do is talk about America in the 1860s. So the time period of the 1860s was a very unique time in America, like I said before, because some technology was way ahead of its time and some wasn't. So what I want to do just briefly is talk about communication during the Civil War. In the lead up to the Civil War, during the 1850s, the network of train tracks or railroads in the United States exploded. In the North, they had about 22,000 miles of track when the war started, and the South had about 9,500 miles of track. What the railroads enabled people to do is move people and supplies much more quickly than they had been able to move them in the past. And little things, canned food, like you go home and open the cupboard and, did that thing change or am I hallucinating? It changed. Can you still hear me? Okay. So you go home and open your cupboard and there's some canned corn, no big deal, right? The first time that ever appeared in America was in 1812. At the very beginning, that was the first time at one store you could actually get canned food. So over the next few decades, that grew and grew and grew. And so by the time the 1860s come, when the war starts, we have canned food, which we can move on trains in large amounts. And we also have trains that can move people. If you want to fight a big battle, you need a lot of people. People got to eat. So you got to send the people and the food together. And the trains enabled both sides to do that pretty well. The North actually had the upper hand in this. The North had the foresight or the luck to make all their train tracks the same width and same size. So if I owned a railroad company and I'm sending stuff on cars over here, and now it's going to go the rest of the way on your railroad company, you could take my cars, put them on your track, and be on your way. In the South, no one could get along. So all the people who owned railroads, they made their train tracks different widths. So now if we want to trade contents, we got to go park my train, get some people to unload it, hand load the next one, and then you're on your way. So we can move people and we can move goods, unlike we ever had been able to before in a war. Also during the 1840s, the telegraph was invented before that, but in the 1840s, a lot more telegraph line was laid. So a telegraph enables you to use Morse code to communicate in virtually real time. That was unheard of in a war. Abraham Lincoln was the very first president who could talk to his generals in the battlefield in real time. Up to that time, the people at the upper level may not even know there was a battle until a week and a half later, much less have any influence as to what was going on during the battle. But because of the telegraph, Lincoln could know where his forces were, where the enemy forces were, how the battle was going. He could get with all the head generals, strategize, and send out orders. So real-time communication happened like it had never happened before. This enabled the newspapers to keep the public abreast of everything that was going on. It also allowed them to write all kinds of articles and editorials to make sure that the people supported the war. Right? All across the political spectrum, right? There's the talking heads yelling at you on cable TV. Well, back in the day, these guys had to yell in print in their editorials, but it still served the same purpose. So the last thing here, in 1861, the first time people started using balloons to float someone up and to look at what's going on during the battle. So you could actually tell where your enemy was. So if you look at all this, you know where your enemy is and what he's doing, right? You can tell your president and your generals about that, and they can come up with the best plan of action on how to fight. Then you can send your people and the food that they need to where they need to go. So transportation and communication was really, really good, okay? That's going to contribute to massive battles and a lot of loss of life. The second thing that we're going to talk about is weapons. So actually tomorrow, Alan Lohr, who teaches the gunsmithing program, is going to give a talk on weapons during the Civil War. He's going to forget more about weapons on the drive over here than I've ever known in my life. So he's going to spend an hour and a half talking about just that. I want to talk about just a little bit. So we got really good at killing each other right before the Civil War started. So the first thing I want to talk about are these little guys. These are called mini balls or Minié balls. This is a bullet that was invented by a Frenchman named Claude Minié. So people pronounce it Minié or Mini or however. Before these guys came along, so basically every battle before the Civil War, you had a musket that had a smooth barrel on the inside and round bullets. Okay? The round bullets were like the full metal jacket bullets we have today. They didn't expand. So if they hit bone, they broke it, went through it, and if they hit your tissue, it would go through it. Okay? Also, because the inside of the barrels were smooth, the bullet didn't spin as it was traveling, so it was only accurate to about 50 yards because it would start to tumble. It would go about 200, but if you were more than 50 yards away, good luck, right? So what happened right before the Civil War started is these kind of bullets came out. Now, they still use muskets for a long time, but the insides of the barrels were rifled. And so the bullet would spin as it went through the barrel, which makes it more accurate and makes it go farther. So now instead of being accurate to 50 yards, we're accurate to 300 yards. Instead of the thing traveling 300 yards period, now it will go half a mile. Okay? And also the way these bullets worked, you see this hollow point right here, the hollow section? When the gunpowder burned and the gases were developed to push the bullet out, those gases would fill up this little scoop section here, and the soft lead bullet would expand so it would fit in the barrel. Then it would spin perfectly down the barrel and be on its way. But the point there is that it was made out of soft lead. And so now, when these bullets would impact human flesh, it was completely different. The round musket balls were hard, so they would just break bone. These new bullets, the mini bullets or Minié bullets, would pulverize it. They basically act like hollow points. So when they hit flesh, they expand, they balloon out and start tumbling around. And so when they hit bone, it's not a clean break, it's destroyed. If it hits tissue, it just doesn't punch its way through, it rips its way through. So a wound from these type of bullets was a completely different ballgame than anyone had ever seen before. And 95% of the injuries from the Civil War came from these bullets. People really had to learn because when you had a smooth bored musket, it was only accurate to 50 yards. So you get two huge masses of people, one group would charge, these guys would get off a shot or two, and then the aggressors would be on the defenders with bayonets and they'd fight it out hand to hand. What happens now is someone tries to charge and they start getting picked off way before they even get close. And so in the Civil War, bayonets were pretty much a non-issue. Less than 1% of Civil War wounds came from a bayonet or a knife because weaponry advanced to the point that they were kind of redundant. Also, during the Civil War, right before it started, repeating rifles were invented. They didn't become widely used until later in the war and then just in some areas. And so you would have a rifle, like a lever action. So you could drop in a tube with 7 bullets and shoot them, and you could shoot about 20 bullets a minute. Everything before then was about 2 or 3. So you vastly increased your rate of fire. Also, we had battleships. They enforced the blockade that the North had on the South, so the South couldn't get any supplies, and they actually fought it out a few times. These are metal-covered battleships, really. We started out in decades before with sails, wooden ships, and they would just be pulverized by ships like this. The doctor that invented the Gatling gun in 1862, he made it so he could make a weapon so horrific that no one would ever want to fight again. It didn't exactly pan out that way. So this was basically, it wasn't the first true machine gun because it wasn't, the next bullet fired wasn't loaded by the power release from the last one being fired. You had to hand crank it, right? Has anyone ever seen the movie The Outlaw Josie Wales? Best Western ever made. There's a Gatling gun in that movie. And what you have to do to fire it is take this shaft right here and turn it by hand. The faster you turn it, the faster the gun fires. So this was the very first kind of semi-machine gun, okay? So we look at this, the point of all this is our weaponry immediately before the Civil War. The technology increased to the point where we could kill each other like never before. So we know where to go, we can get our supplies there, and we have the weapons to do the job. So the question is, do we have the medical knowledge that we need to help the people that are wounded? And the answer to that is not even close. So that's what we're going to talk about now. So if you look here, I'm going to sneak some science into this presentation. These are Koch's postulates, okay? This is how you really know if a particular microorganism causes a disease, okay? Until you go through these postulates, you never really know that. So to talk about that, I want to talk about Petri dishes really quick. I actually brought some. So this is how we grow bacteria. So this is bacteria. These are called mannitol salt agar plates. See how there's nothing on that one? There's nothing growing on this. This has seaweed in it that's been dissolved in a solution that has everything a bacteria needs to grow, and until I opened it, it was sterile. If we let this sit out until tomorrow, it wouldn't be sterile anymore. What we can do is put bacteria on those plates, and can you guys see this? Can you see the tiny little individual colonies? That's how we grow bacteria. Each one of those colonies used to be one bacteria, but it divided over time to form a colony of millions. But each of the separate ones used to be one bacteria. This is a Staphylococcus aureus, and this is Staphylococcus simulans. So if you guys want to check these out, they're right here. Don't open these. Yeah, thanks. Who's going to shake my hand after this? Probably nobody. Okay. These are actually really safe. If you touch them, you should wash your hands just because it's a good thing to do, but you can check these out if you want. Okay. So if you look at this, here's those Petri dishes that I just showed you, right? So let's say we have some mice that are dying, and we have no idea why. What we can do is take some fluid from them and put them on these Petri dishes. And what's going to happen is the individual types of bacteria, because there's going to be bunches of them, they're going to grow. So that little colony right there is small in a particular color. It's also present here and here. That's a kind of bacteria growing in that animal. We have no clue what it is. If we look here, here's a much larger colony that's also growing in all of the animals that died. So if we take samples, fluid samples, from all the mice that died, and also a sample from a mouse that's healthy and not suffering from the disease, and we take the same fluid from the same area, the same amount, and we put that on an agar plate, bacteria is going to grow on all of them. Okay? But if you look here, the mice that died all have this large red colony growing on them, but the mice that aren't sick don't have it. So that's your first indication that, hey, maybe this kind of bacteria is causing those mice to die, right? So what you then need to do is take just the bacteria from this colony and put it on a brand new plate. Since you took just this bacteria and put it on a brand new plate, all of this bacteria is this guy. Okay, so you took maybe a few hundred of them, transferred them to a new dish, and now you have millions upon millions, but they're all the exact same thing. So what you do is take that pure culture of bacteria, you find yourself some unlucky but healthy mice, and you infect them with it. Okay? Now, if that bacteria is what's causing these mice to die, then when you take a healthy mouse and you inject this bacteria into it, it should die. And then when you analyze the fluid in its body, you should have that exact same bacteria. Okay? That's the only way you can unequivocally say that this bacteria causes this disease. And that seems pretty logical, right? But the thing is, that wasn't even proposed until 1877. So the Civil War happened in the 1860s. So in the 1860s, no one knew that germs caused infectious diseases. That didn't happen until just a few years later. The theories they had at the time were all kinds of crazy things. Some people thought it was divine retribution. Some people thought that it was bad air. As many people there were, that's how many theories there were, because no one knew. And then this guy came along, performed this experiment, and this seems so simple now, but this stunned the world, because now we know germs cause disease. And so now maybe we can start down the pathway of being able to do something about it. But in the Civil War, they didn't even know that. Some other things as well. This is a kit that a surgeon would have. So if you need your leg amputated or you need some kind of surgery, this is the tools that a surgeon is going to have at their disposal. As late as 1861, there were several states that still outlawed dissection of cadavers by medical students. So a battlefield surgeon could arrive on the job the first day and have never seen the anatomy of a human. So some screaming wounded soldiers put on a table in front of him, and he's supposed to amputate their leg. He has no clue what the inside of a leg looks like. And so that kind of on-the-job training, so to speak, took a toll on soldiers and also on doctors. This is a really old stethoscope, right? This is a really old microscope. These are common diagnostic tools that medical professionals use to help diagnose your signs and symptoms to let them know what's wrong with you. Both of these existed before the Civil War, but they really weren't used. Harvard Medical School didn't have a stethoscope, didn't have a microscope until after the Civil War. So some of the tools they did have, they couldn't or didn't take advantage of. The one thing they did have was some drugs. They had a lot of opium and opium derivatives. That helped people with pain. So you could actually perform surgeries and put people under and then give them pain meds afterward. This is one thing that they did have. The South wasn't so lucky sometimes, though. Because of the blockade, they basically couldn't get supplies from anywhere. So when they ran out of morphine and other things like opium, when they had to do an amputation, it was basically a couple shots of whiskey and here we go. That's all they had. The last thing that the medical field didn't have was the miracle drug of the 20th century, in my opinion, and that's antibiotics. Antibiotics weren't available for prescription until the 1930s, and that really hasn't been that long. So nowadays, if you have a bacterial infection, as long as the bacteria aren't resistant, you can take an antibiotic and like magic, the illness goes away. They didn't have access to these, so they basically had no pharmaceutical way to prevent the spread and growth of bacteria. That wouldn't come until the 30s. Okay, last thing here, when the war started, the Union only had 98 registered doctors and the Confederacy had 24. Those are registered. I went to medical school and got my diploma. There were a lot more doctors, but they were people who wanted to be doctors, so they were. And they got trained on the job, and a lot of them got, from everything I read, got really good at it. At the end of the war, the Union had about 10,000 doctors, and the Confederacy had about 4,000. But this is where it started. And a lot of the training was, like I said, on the job. Okay, so if we sum all that up, everything we've talked about so far, 3 points. Vastly improved communication. We know where to send soldiers, and we have the capability to send them there, and we have the capability to plan in real time. We also have vastly improved weapons. We can kill much better than we could in previous wars and previous decades. But unfortunately, we're in the medical dark ages for every reason that we just spent the last little bit talking about. Okay, so what I want to do now is shift gears a little bit and talk about where these diseases came from and the different types you could get, so on and so forth. And so to talk about that, I have this picture here of the 44th Infantry from Illinois. It really doesn't matter. That picture doesn't matter about where those soldiers are from, because that picture was repeated all over the place, in every place that soldiers were mustered. The thing I want to talk about here is how all these people, most of them probably came from little small towns, little small villages, and most of them had probably never traveled that much in their life, okay? So they're off to war, they're leaving behind their very small community, and it's not like it is now. I could be in Africa tomorrow if I really wanted to, right? But it wasn't that way back then. What that also means is people's immune systems were used to a very small area. So if my community had gotten smallpox or measles and I got sick and recovered, I'm immune for life. And so when I go meet the rest of my soldiers from all over the place, I'm probably not going to get sick from those things. But if I haven't had the measles and I haven't had smallpox, then the very first thing that's going to happen when I get to where I'm meeting the rest of my fellow soldiers from all these different places, they're bringing those diseases with them. And so the first thing that's going to happen to me is I'm going to get sick. Those things are either going to kill me or I'm going to recover and be immune to them because there's really no drugs available that can help me, okay? So if you read these accounts of the Civil War, I think this is a very good description, right? So you have all these people with naive immune systems converging on a very small area. At the time, the military had rules in place. So you put your latrine or your toilet downstream from your drinking water. But from all accounts, that was adhered to not very well. People came together, time was short, they needed to get to where the fight was. No one really cared where the latrine was. So it was common to have fecal matter just drifting down the stream that you then had to drink out of. So any microorganism that's spread by an oral fecal route, which is a lot of them, those were going to be problems, right? The food that you had, they called it hardtack back then, but it was basically crackers. That's pretty much what you had to eat. There wasn't a lot of fresh fruit, and so people would get scurvy, just a vitamin C deficiency from not eating fruit, and so your teeth fall out. When you get people crowded together, any kind of disease that's spread by the respiratory system is much more likely to be passed back and forth. If people are dispersed, if I'm out by myself and I sneeze, no one cares. If I sneeze in here, all you guys are getting a piece of what I'm blowing out, right? It just, if you ever seen a sneeze in slow motion, it'll creep you out. It's amazing how much fluid dispersal you get in aerosol over a wide area when that happens. And if I have TB in that, then you better watch out, that kind of thing. Okay, also bugs. We used to have a bad problem with malaria in America. And then we killed all the mosquitoes that we could, a particular kind of mosquito, and most of that went away. Back then, there was nothing we could do about bugs. So arthropod carry diseases like malaria, we were pretty much at the mercy of those. Some organisms we're going to talk about here in a little bit are carried by mosquitoes, so if they bite us, they give them to us. And if you've ever been around a place, fishing or camping, and there's mosquitoes around, there's no way you can keep away from all of them. So our water is contaminated. Our food, if we try to wash it, it's going to be contaminated with contaminated water. And so the food's contaminated as well. The food itself is bad, not nutritious, and we're missing a lot of nutrients, which is going to make our immune systems depressed. We're crowded together, and because we're crowded together, it's going to make it very easy to pass diseases back and forth. And then finally, we're at the mercy of all these bugs, right? So anything carried by a mosquito or lice or whatever is going to be spread pretty easily. So this is not a comprehensive list of the diseases that could have affected soldiers, but it's the ones I'm going to talk about. Before we talk about the specific ones, keep in mind, these were making soldiers sick and killing soldiers by the hundreds of thousands before they even got to the battlefield. The killing for these reasons continued once they got there, but this started the second they left home. Okay, so we're going to talk just a little bit about dysentery, typhoid, pneumonia, measles, tuberculosis, and malaria. The list goes on and on. There was some cholera, there was some smallpox, so this is not meant to be exhaustive at all. The reason I picked the ones that I did is that they killed the most soldiers. So dysentery is a condition that's a person has diarrhea and there's blood in the diarrhea, okay? So that killed 45,000 Union soldiers and about 50,000 Confederate soldiers. So there's 100,000 people gone just like that from bloody diarrhea. The organisms that cause dysentery, there's many of them actually, I'm just showing two here. Bacterial dysentery is caused by a bacteria that's called Shigella. This is a picture of Shigella bacteria right here. There's also a type of dysentery that's called amoebic dysentery. It's caused by a eukaryotic protozoan, a picture of which is shown right here. Both of these types of organisms are vastly different. One's a bacteria, one's a protozoan. So one's eukaryotic and one's prokaryotic, if you've heard those terms before. But they all cause the same thing. As soon as the Shigella gets into your intestines, it releases this toxin and starts killing the epithelial layer or the innermost layer of your digestive system. The amoeba here, or actually here's a better picture, it can actually bore right through it, and then it gets into your blood. So it's destroying the tissue that makes up your colon, your small and large intestine, then it invades your body, right? And if you get diarrhea like this from these types of organisms, I'm not talking like a little bit of diarrhea. So I'm talking like a liter of diarrhea every hour. And that's just not something that your body can maintain. You're losing too much fluid and you're losing too much electrolytes. So diarrhea like that, if you can't do anything about it, is going to kill you very, very quickly. I hope I'm not ruining dinner for anyone. This is where things go downhill a little bit. So it's not like the doctors in the Civil War were just going to throw up their hands. They were going to do what they could to cure these people. And so what I've done is thrown in some wartime treatments for these diseases, nowhere near all of them. And here's a truism in medicine. If there's a lot of remedies for a disease, that means none of them work. That's generally true. So some of the things that were given for dysentery are opium, strychnine. Opium's just a narcotic, right? Strychnine is what we put in rat poison. What that causes is muscle spasms. What actually kills rats when you give them rat poison or strychnine, it causes uncontrollable muscle spasms, and their diaphragm, which is a muscle right here in charge of your breathing, it clenches and doesn't let go. So breathing stops and the organism dies. So not very effective. Silver nitrate is just a liquid solution of silver. Silver is a heavy metal. When heavy metals bind to living organisms, messes up their enzymes and hopefully kills the bacteria. You can actually get clothes now that are impregnated with silver. This theoretically should work. And so what you can do is go camping for like 2 or 3 weeks and never change your clothes. And all that silver keeps the bacteria down so you don't smell bad. So it'll work for things like that. But for an internal infection, silver nitrate's not going to do much. Quinine is the bark of a tree that comes from Peru. And it's actually, as we're going to talk about, the one effective drug they had for malaria. But they gave it for everything. And it didn't work for dysentery, okay? They also gave whiskey. What you're going to see in every one of these diseases is they're slightly different, but everyone gets opium and everyone gets whiskey because that's what they could do. They could at least make people semi-comfortable. And then lastly, they would cauterize the anal canal, hoping that would make the diarrhea stop, which sounds horrific, was horrific, and also ineffective. And then finally, they would give people ipecac, which makes you puke, okay? So that was the attempts to try to prevent this massive bloody diarrhea known as dysentery, and from the numbers of dead soldiers, you can see that it didn't work, okay? The second really bad disease was typhoid fever. When they talk about dysentery and also typhoid, these illnesses are called slate wipers because they wipe the slate clean. In other words, they kill everybody, wipe the slate clean, and then people can reproduce and refill that area. So if you look at typhoid killed about 35,000 Union soldiers, and it killed about 30,000 Confederate soldiers. Typhoid is caused by an organism called Salmonella typhi or Salmonella typhimurium, okay? So this Salmonella is also spread back and forth by the oral fecal route. So if you get fecal matter and water, then you ingest that, the cycle just keeps on going. This is what the Salmonella looks like. It came from contaminated water, evidently. It came from contaminated water and food, okay? I missed a typo. If you came down with this, there was a 1 in 3 chance that you were gonna die from it, okay? And what would happen is you would get large abscesses where the infection was, the bacteria would get into your blood, you get a super high fever, and then you would become delirious, which is what typhoid means, and then you would die, okay? And there was not much anyone could do about it. Analgesics are painkillers, so they would give you painkillers, quinine again, calomel. Calomel is a mixture of chalk and mercury. Mercury is really toxic, right? It'll shut your central nervous system down, but they use it as a drug a lot. So you'd mix up some chalk with some mercury, give that to someone and hope for the best. And then opium, whiskey, and turpentine, which we use to clean paintbrushes. So it probably wasn't that effective. Nowadays, we give you some antibiotics, you'd be fine, okay? So another disease that killed a lot of people was pneumonia. So here we're looking at about 20,000 people dying on the Union side and about 17,000 people dying on the Confederate side. If you look at these pictures, these are little bacteria in lung tissue. So this is human tissue. Down here we have influenza virus. So pneumonia is a condition that can be caused by viruses and bacteria and other organisms as well. What happens is this: if you look at your respiratory tree, you have your big giant trachea, right? Air goes down there. It branches off to 2 primary bronchi. Those feed into your two lungs. It keeps branching smaller and smaller and smaller until at the very bottom of your respiratory tree, it looks like bundles of grapes. That's what it looks like. The little grapes are called alveoli. They're really, really thin, and blood vessels from your lungs wrap around them. So when you breathe in, you're breathing in oxygen. That oxygen travels down your respiratory tree, gets to the alveoli, and diffuses into your blood, right? Carbon dioxide is the waste product you give off when you make energy. I'm sneaking in science again. The carbon dioxide will diffuse from the blood vessels around the lungs into the alveoli, and then when you breathe out, you're getting rid of it. So when you breathe in, you bring in the good stuff, the oxygen for your blood. When you breathe out, you get rid of the waste product, which is carbon dioxide. That's how you keep reoxygenating your blood. Now, those gases have to move back and forth. They have to go across the wall of the alveoli, across the wall of the capillaries in the lungs, and into the blood. That's a tiny, tiny little distance. The respiratory membrane is super small, so it's easy for gases to move back and forth. Now, if you think of the alveoli being like a grape, the exterior of the grape is the respiratory membrane. So gases come into the middle where it's hollow, and then they diffuse out into the blood. What pneumonia does is cause your body to flood that area with liquid. So you fill up your hollow alveoli with fluid. And so now, if you want to get oxygen into your blood, instead of going from this hollow alveoli through this little tiny membrane, it has to go all the way through the fluid, then to the membrane, then into the blood. And it's not going to happen. If you fill up your lungs with fluid, that's what pneumonia really is in the end. You can't get oxygen into your blood, you can't get carbon dioxide out, and so you basically asphyxiate, okay? This was a huge problem because these organisms, noticing a theme here, are entirely out of control. Another reason that it was such a problem is because 70% of the people in the Civil War time period used tobacco. Some people chewed, some people smoked. The problem with smoking is this. When you start out with that trachea and you branch off into smaller tubes going to each lung and then deeper into your lung, if you look at the interior of those tubes, they're covered with sticky mucus, okay? And also embedded in that sticky mucus are little tiny like hairs called cilia that sweep upward. And that has a very specific purpose. If I breathe something in, I get the air, right? But what if I breathe in a virus or a bacteria? What hopefully happens is those organisms are trapped in the sticky mucus that makes up the respiratory tree. So they're trapped. They can't get down deep into my lungs and cause pneumonia. And those cilia that beat them upward into the back of my throat, where I can spit them out or I can swallow them. If I spit them out, that gets them out of my body. If I swallow them, now they're in the acid of my stomach and they'll probably be killed. Problem with smoking is you stop the cilia. They quit beating. You smoke a cigarette, and for 8 hours, it doesn't beat. You still make the mucus. And so the organisms you breathe in get trapped in the mucus, but the mucus doesn't get moved upward because the cilia are paralyzed. So what it does is just sink down and down and down and down into your alveoli. And so you're basically delivering the microorganisms to the most vulnerable part of your lungs. That was my anti-smoking rant for this presentation. Okay, so what people tried to do, they're not just going to sit there and let it happen, right? People were still being bled in the Civil War. It was going out of fashion during the war, but physicians still did it. What they would do is open a vein, drain some blood, hope for the best. And that's really not going to do anything. But they could always give them whiskey and opium, mercury and quinine, which really didn't do anything, but it was better than nothing. Okay. Could someone tell me what time it is? I want to make sure it's not like 7 o'clock. That's far. Oh, okay, plenty of time. Okay, thank you. Okay, another infectious disease was measles. Measles is caused by a paramyxovirus. Okay, and it's very, very contagious. So if you're in close quarters with someone else, which people always were during the Civil War, then you're quite likely to get it. What happens is you get all these sores on your body, and believe it or not, I think there's an impression among people that measles really isn't that bad, but measles can kill you. About 11,000 people died of measles during the Civil War, and right before the vaccines came out, a few decades ago, I think the 50s maybe, or 60s, about 500 children a year died of measles. So measles isn't one of those, it's a lot bigger deal to get it than I think sometimes people think it is. So some of those treatments we had for that were some interesting new ones that we haven't talked about yet. Cupping was actually used for other diseases we've already talked about as well. In cupping, what they would do is take a cup, fill it full of alcohol, light the alcohol on fire, and let it burn down, and then turn it over upside down and stick it on your skin. And what that would do is create a vacuum. So that you get a massive blister and pull blood from your body up into this blister. And then they would take off the cup, lance the blister, let the blood leave, and then hope that would help you somehow. It didn't, but it was something to do. People also had what are called counter irritants. So if one part of your body was irritated, like say you had an infection somewhere, if you could irritate another part of your body, that might help. So what they would do is if they thought there were problems with your liver, they would paint your liver with different caustic compounds like acids or iodine, and hopefully that pain and irritation would help the internal problem. Okay? And I'm not making light of the techniques that they had. This is just all they had. So they did the best that they could. Like people during this time didn't even know that organisms even cause diseases. So they didn't have the luxury of knowing all these things that we do now. Nowadays, you get vaccinated for measles and there's no reason anyone should ever have to have it. So it's not even an issue. But back then, there was literally nothing that they could do about it. Okay. And then tuberculosis. Tuberculosis is caused by a bacteria called Mycobacterium tuberculosis. This is actually a pretty big problem worldwide. There's still millions of people every year who die of tuberculosis. Here's what the bacteria looks like. The problem with tuberculosis is you breathe it in, it gets down deep in your lungs, and then you have some immune system cells that are called macrophages. Macrophages are part of your immune system that they find foreign things, they engulf them, and they kill them. So a macrophage literally cruises around your body looking for something that shouldn't be there. And if it finds something like that, it phagocytizes it, which is nerd speak for it brings it inside of itself, and then it destroys it. And that takes the foreign invader out of circulation. Unless you're talking about Mycobacterium. Mycobacterium likes to live inside macrophages. And so this is a very, very hard bacterial infection to get rid of because the immune system cells that should kill it, it thinks are home. Okay? So when you get tuberculosis in your lungs, here's what happens. This is normal, right? So I'm not sure how good the quality of the picture is out there, but these are ribs, right? This is where your heart is, a little more on the left side. Here's your spinal column, so on and so forth. And here's your lungs deep or past, okay? That's what a normal, healthy lung should look like. But when you get infected with Mycobacterium tuberculosis, it goes into your lungs, lives in the immune system cells that are trying to kill it. So the only thing your body can do is try to surround it by fibrous connective tissue. If it can't kill it, it can at least wall it off and keep it from spreading some other place. And most of the time that actually works, but you start to see these hard nodules in the lungs of people who are infected with TB. The problem with these nodules is the bacteria inside are not dead. So 30 years later, they could break out and you're in trouble all over again. Okay. So it had a 1 in 20 death rate, and some of the wartime treatments were some of the ones we've already talked about. Okay. So I think this is the last of the environmental infectious diseases. So this soldier hasn't even gotten to war yet, and look at what he's already had to deal with. So malaria is caused by the life cycle of this pesky mosquito. It's not just any mosquito, it's the Anopheles mosquito. Inside that mosquito is a protozoan called Plasmodium. There's different species of Plasmodium. A bunch of different kinds can cause malaria, but they all belong to the genus Plasmodium. So what happens is this. This mosquito is going to bite someone infected with malaria. Now the mosquito's infected. Okay? So the mosquito goes to that new recruit who just showed up from someplace where there's no malaria, and he bites that person. Right? So now that's going to inject the Plasmodium organism inside of the blood of that person. This is a blood smear from a human. These are all red blood cells. And then these are the organism. Those organisms are in the blood, so now they're going to go to the liver and hang out there for a while and grow in number. Okay? After they grow in number for a while, they're going to leave the liver, they're going to go invade the red blood cells. And so what they're going to do is grow and multiply and increase in number inside the red blood cells until they decide to burst. Then they burst a bunch of your red blood cells. That turns all the new organisms loose, but only now there's a lot more of them, and they infect more red blood cells. And the cycle continues. Eventually, the mosquito is going to come along, drink some of this blood, and get reinfected to make sure that the cycle continues. Now, the problem for people is that inside of your red blood cells is the hemoglobin that you use to carry oxygen around your body. And part of that molecule is iron. So when your red blood cells burst, you release iron into your body. That's a very, very bad thing. Whenever iron's in your body, it's complex to another molecule to hide it, to sequester it. Free iron in your body causes bacteria that are normally inside but present no problem to increase in numbers to the point where they can kill you. Also, if you look at the body as a whole, it's the job of your spleen to filter your blood. And so all the blood in your body periodically is going through your spleen, and your spleen takes a look at the red blood cells. Okay, you're good, you're healthy, keep on going, you're healthy, you keep on going. You were worn out, time for you to be recycled. And so those worn out red blood cells will be destroyed, but it's okay because you're always making more. Their component parts will be broken down, and you'll build new red blood cells. The problem is, if you're this organism, the plasmodium, you don't want to go to the spleen because you'll get destroyed there. And so what the organism does is start secreting these compounds while it's inside the red blood cells. It makes them stick to the walls of the blood vessels. That way, they can sit there in the red blood cell and divide, but they're never going to have to go through and actually enter into the spleen. So what the cells are doing is sticking to the walls of your blood vessels. That's a big problem. What happens if you shut off blood flow to your brain or other vital organs? And that can happen with this organism. So untreated malaria is, people are still trying to make a vaccine for it. Untreated malaria kills millions of people in the world every year. Not in America, because we kill the mosquito that carries it. There's still malaria that happens in the US, not very many cases every year, but most of the people who get it were traveling somewhere and then came home. Okay, so everything we've talked about so far is just the diseases that a soldier is going to come in contact with before he even gets to battle. He hasn't even fought anybody yet, right? Now, those are also going to continue. He's going to continue to be exposed to those while he's fighting, but even before he has a chance to fire a shot, this has a good chance of taking him down. So the next thing is sexually transmitted diseases. So to get some data, I looked through some of the records that are published. And what these numbers are cases of venereal disease in U.S. soldiers per 1,000 soldiers per year for the Union. Okay? A lot of the records for the Confederacy were destroyed. So these numbers are for the Union. So if you look at this, in general, the United States Army in 1860, 82 soldiers out of 1,000 at any one time had a venereal disease. If you look at some places, like the Department of the Pacific in 1862, 461 out of 1,000 had a venereal disease. So almost half the people had one kind of venereal disease or another. And if you look at the history of this, it's really fascinating. I didn't know a lot about some of it, but if you look at some of the battles, soldiers from the Department of the Pacific, which would be along the west coastline, they went and joined the soldiers from New Mexico, who also have a really high rate of venereal disease. They went to fight the Confederate soldiers in Texas, and they got whooped up on. They just pretty much got destroyed. And so people relate that sometimes to battle tactics, supplies, but a lot of historians argue that if you look at the VD rates, those had direct implications on the results of battles. Because once you join these two departments together, almost half the soldiers have VD. And as we're going to talk about, the treatments for VD were pretty much the same as the ones we've already talked about, ineffective and sometimes very painful. So a lot of times if you had lesions in your genital area, they would just cauterize it with heat. So you're riding your horse across the Southwest with VD that was cauterized, you're not in the mood to fight. So this is my safe sex lecture. I'm just getting warmed up on that. So, okay. So some things that contributed to this, condoms have been around for hundreds of years before this, but a lot of them are made out of sheepskin And so their shelf life wasn't very long, and there weren't, herds of sheep following the soldiers around. So prophylactics like that weren't really widely available. Latex condoms hit the market in 1876, right after the war. So I wondered, what did that do to the VD rate of soldiers? You would think it would go down. So I got some data from America in 1889, and it's still ridiculously high. And then the British Army in 1890, so 15 years roughly after latex condoms were available, still 20%. So the VD rates were really high, which had direct implications on the results of battles. That's why we're talking about this, because the battles that were fought, a lot of times were fought by people who were infected with infectious diseases and probably not at their fighting best. The two kinds of VD I'm going to talk about are syphilis and gonorrhea. The thing about both these diseases is if you get those nowadays, you take some penicillin and you're good to go. Those diseases are obviously not gone. In Maricopa County, there's about 800 cases of syphilis, new ones every year. But we can treat that with antibiotics, no big deal. So far, Neisseria gonorrhea, the organism that causes it, is not drug resistant. So let's talk about syphilis because it was the main one. Syphilis is horrific if it's untreated. So what happened is this. Syphilis is a venereal disease that's caused by a bacteria. It's called Treponema pallidum. Easy to kill with antibiotics. Really easy. But what happens is this. If you contract syphilis, the first thing that happens is you get a painless sore or a painless canker, which the doctors at that time are going to cauterize, right? Now, a few weeks later, you may get a rash, sores, and joint pain, and then it all goes away. For years, decades, but the organism is still there. This is one of those diseases that it's kind of a catch-22 because you get infected with it and you have some problems, but then it goes away for decades and you don't even know you're going to have issues, especially back then, so you keep spreading it. The problem with that is after an undetermined amount of time, decades probably, maybe multiple decades, the organism is still there and it starts to attack your nervous system. Central nervous system. It starts to attack your brain. And so what it does is literally make you go insane because you're having your central nervous system tissue destroyed. Also, towards the end, you start getting really hard skin, plates of it, and with these pus-filled blisters on top of it. You waste away, total delirium, out of your mind, and you start to get these very large sores that are filled with fluid. And then, unfortunately, you pass away. Now, if you look here, among white Union soldiers, there was about 73,000 cases of those. Okay, so there were quite a few. During the war, what they tried to do is treat people by shooting silver nitrate up their urethra, right? Every guy in here just cringed. Silver nitrate, I already talked about that. So potash, mercury, and they would cauterize the sores, right? All of those things are completely ineffective. So the true, not the only, but part of the tragedy of syphilis in the Civil War didn't happen until the late 1880s because 70-some thousand people left the war and went home and went back to their wives or girlfriends that they got after the war and then married or whatever and infected them. And so what happened late in the 1800s is that both the North and the South opened veterans homes. So if you were, needed to go to the equivalent of a nursing home, I guess nowadays, you could go live there. And in those places, they kept records. So 1/3 of the people who went to those homes and then died of old age died of syphilis. And so what that also means is that their wives, girlfriends, or whatever probably also died of the same thing. So who knows how many people actually died of syphilis that was acquired during the Civil War, but it was enough to be significant. Okay, last one is gonorrhea. Gonorrhea was more prevalent, but not as bad. So it's thought that 109,397 cases among the white Union soldiers. The data for the Confederacy is pretty much non-existent as far as I could find. A lot of their records were destroyed at the very end of the war. And among the black soldiers, the cases of all venereal disease were lower. What really, I actually should talk about this. The person who gets VD, who's a soldier, is going to be young, is going to be white, and is going to live next to a city. And the white people had a little bit more money, and if you were stationed by a city, you had the time and the means to find a prostitute, pretty much. If you were out in the field all the time, which was more true in the South, you didn't have the time and the means as easily to hire a prostitute. That's thought to be the reason for the difference in the numbers. Now, when you get gonorrhea, the first thing that happens becomes painful to urinate as a guy, and then you start to get discharge from the penis. That's extremely painful. And the end result of it for men is usually that you become sterile. If women are infected, they're usually asymptomatic, which is most of the time true, but it's also not good for them because it can make them sterile as well. The people that really pay the price for an untreated gonorrhea infection are the children of those people. Because if they're not sterile and they have a child, what happens is you get these conjunctivitis infections in the eyes of newborns, which back then they couldn't treat. So it basically destroy their eyes and they would go blind. So it was the kids that paid the big price. Nowadays, a shot of penicillin, you'd be good to go, or some derivative of penicillin. During the wartime, the treatment was pretty much the same as it was for syphilis. Ineffective, but the best that they could do at the time. Okay, how am I doing on time? 20 to 5. Okay. So the last part of this is talking about battlefield infections. So now the person has survived all these infectious diseases that came about from the environment, came about from behavior, and now they actually go to war. And when they go to war, injuries come from that, and that's our new source of infectious diseases. This is not one single quote. I just took sentences from this interview that a surgeon at the time gave. So we operated in old blood-stained and often pus-stained coats. Doesn't sound very sterile. With undisinfected hands. We use undisinfected instruments. Sponges had been used in prior cases and then rinsed off with tap water. I read other accounts of surgeons amputating someone's leg, putting the knife between their teeth, helping that person off, getting a new one on, wiping it off a couple times, and then performing the next surgery. So aseptic technique was unheard of. Most doctors wouldn't touch a chest wound, thoracic cavity, or an abdominal wound. And so if you were shot in the chest, by chest I mean a thoracic cavity, and you survived the impact of the bullet, there was a 62% chance you were going to die from infection. Okay? If you were shot in the abdomen, it was even worse. When you get shot in the abdomen, if you perforate your colon, you're going to be leaking fecal matter into your abdominal cavity, and bacterial infection, sepsis, and death is going to come very shortly after that. So 87% of the time, people were shot in the abdomen and survived the shooting incident. They still died from infection. Okay? If you look at this, 3% of American wounded in World War II died. So if you got shot in World War II and you survived the gunshot, you had a 97% chance of surviving. Yet all of these guys, it was completely opposite. Why is that? What happened in the 1930s? Antibiotics, yeah, good job. Antibiotics came out and these infection rates went through the floor. Now you get shot and you live, there's a 97% chance you're going to be just fine. But not in the Civil War, and that's what we're talking about. So the people who died from wounds like this died one of two ways: of infection, which we're going to talk about, or hemorrhage. So if you're trying to operate on someone and you have an artery, the person's going to bleed out unless you can shut that artery down. So what they would do is tie them shut with silk thread and hope for the best. What you would want would be a clot to develop and blood to be shut off, and for that to hold. What happened a lot of the time is that people would, they get an amputation, they would tie off the arteries, the person would live for days, be ready to be discharged, and then something would happen to the blood vessels, the clot would blow, and they'd bleed out right there in front of everyone. There's nothing anyone could do about it. So that was hemorrhage. But a lot of people also died of infections, infectious diseases. So in an effort to prevent this from happening, because we see these atrocious death rates. If you're shot in the chest, 62% chance of dying. If you're shot in the abdomen, 87% chance of dying. If you're shot in an extremity, remember we talked about those mini balls or Meunier balls? They don't just break bone and pierce tissue, they destroy everything. And that's an infection waiting to happen. And so to deal with extremity wounds, usually they were amputated. Okay? So there was 174,000 extremity wounds, which resulted in about 30,000 amputations. Now, if you got shot in the forearm, down here in your leg, you had a really good chance of living, only a 14% fatality rate. If you had to be amputated at the shoulder joint or at your hips, then things are not looking nearly so good. Basically, the closer you are to the core of your body, the more dangerous it is, because the journey for the bacteria to get into your abdominal, your abdomen or your thoracic cavity is that much shorter. So it increases the chances that infection is going to happen. So what a surgeon would do is this. You get shot in the forearm. The bone is pulverized. The flesh is just mangled. And so they have to amputate it. So what happens is someone holds you down, and then they didn't really use tourniquets like you would think they would a lot of the time. Someone grabs a hold of your skin above where they're going to amputate it and pulls it back. Then they take a knife and cut through the muscle and bone all the way down to the bone. And then they take a saw and they saw through the bone, and then they drop the appendage away. The next step is to take a file and file the end of the bone smooth. And your bone is very rich in blood and nerves, so that had to have been just horrific. And then once you file it back a little bit and smooth, you let that flesh go, which now goes over the bone, and you sew it shut. So you're hiding the bone. Otherwise, you'll get a bone infection. Another disease we're not even talking about, just for the sake of time. So hopefully when you close that skin around the bone, you can keep infection from happening or spreading. And depending on where it is, that was really effective. So that's an 86% chance if you get your forearm amputated, you're going to be fine. Okay, so the whole problem with the chest wounds, the abdominal wounds, and also the amputations is that you could get one of two really major diseases. The first one is gangrene. This is a guy who got shot with a mini ball. That's a bullet wound that's turning into gangrene. Okay? There's different kinds of gangrene, but they all have one thing in common. They stop blood flow to an area of your body. There's what's called dry gangrene. That happens in people who are diabetic, and especially if you're diabetic and you smoke, because what that does is destroy your circulatory system in your extremities, and so you lose the ability to bring blood to your hands and your legs. And when you can't bring blood to an area of your body, that area undergoes necrosis or cell death, and that part of your body dies. Okay? Now the problem with wounds is that you're basically doing the same thing. You have a horrible wound and you're cutting off blood supply to whatever's downstream. And so gangrene will start to set in. There's different types of organisms that can cause gangrene, but the main one's Clostridium. Okay? So nowadays we could treat that with antibiotics. But back then there wasn't much you could do. Some of the treatments that they had for gangrene are kind of interesting. We've talked about these already, but they didn't really work. One effective, very effective way they had that they discovered kind of by serendipity, even though it had been discovered many times throughout the world, is maggots, right? Maggots are disgusting, but maggots only eat dead tissue. They don't eat live tissue. So if you have a wound and the tissue is dying and you put maggots on it, the maggots will eat the dead tissue and leave the live tissue completely alone. So they keep a wound clean, yeah. Yeah, yes. They found, I forget the exact place it happened, but it was in the north, and there was a hospital/prison camp. And so the northern people had some of their soldiers in the hospital, and because they were their soldiers, they did everything they could to keep their wounds clean so they didn't have maggots on them. Their prisoners of war weren't so lucky, or so they thought. They didn't take the time to clean their wounds, so they were infested with maggots. But what they started noticing is the Confederate soldiers were living at much higher rates than the Union ones were. And so they realized that the maggots were actually helpful. And that's been discovered and rediscovered throughout time. That's been used by many different societies in different parts of the world to help keep wounds clean. Okay, the problem with gangrene is eventually you get that bacteria in your blood and you get a massive inflammatory response, bacterial infection of the blood, massive fever, and then death is going to follow after that. It's one of those things that my wife, who's a nurse in the ICU here in town, you ask her what the effects are going to be, and she's like, seizure, coma, death. That's where that kind of infection is heading. Okay, so there's also pyemia, which is blood poisoning. So it's kind of the same old story. Extremely bad to get. 97% of the people who suffered from blood poisoning died of it. And so basically you would have an abscess develop in the wound, and that abscess comes from bacteria, either streptococcus, staphylococcus, or a host of others, not the same ones in my plates I have right there. Those bacteria would start to grow in the infection. The abscess would grow, eventually the bacteria get in your blood, and then the same old story. Massive inflammatory response, bacteria growing in your blood, fever, and then you would die from it. Nowadays, we treat that with antibiotics, probably successfully. Okay, I have no more gruesome pictures to show you. None. So at the end of all of this, the North won. Let's not surprise anybody. But there was a medical aftermath of this, because a lot of people that were involved in this war throughout the war realized that medicine needed to be caught up. It needed to join communication and weaponry and become a little more advanced. So there was actually some good things that came from the Civil War. The first is medical triage and the professional ambulance corps. When the war started, there was no ambulance corps, which means if you were wounded, eventually we might get to you and pick you up, and maybe not. Some of the first battles, I think the first battle of the Bull Run, some of the wounded people were actually on the battlefield lying there for almost a week. And so they died of dehydration because there was just no one available to bring them to where the medical facilities were. So in the war, they started a professional ambulance corps. And nowadays, if you're wounded in battle, there's a plan in place to get to you and to get you where you need to go to get some kind of medical help. But when the war started, there was nothing like that. They also learned a lot about anesthesia. They could use ether or chloroform to knock you out if they were going to amputate a limb, but dosage was a problem. Too much and you're going to kill the person. Not enough and it doesn't work. And so during the war, they worked out, because of repetition, exactly how to do this, better ways to knock people out so you could actually perform surgery on them. They started to realize how important being clean really was. A lot of these diseases came about because of just things being dirty and filthy, right? Fecal matter contamination of virtually everything that your hands would touch. The nursing profession was professionalized. So nurses learned how to address a situation in a specific trained way. However was the best way thought of at that particular time, that's how they were taught to do it. At the beginning of the war, it was haphazard. I'm a nurse, I'm here to comfort you. I don't know anything about medicine. And that very, very quickly changed. Right after the Civil War, just right after it, some things happened that were really important for medicine. So in 1867, Joseph Lister published some work he'd already done about carbolic acid. So we looked at carbolic acid a few slides ago with all those many different remedies. So after a massive infection had happened, people would try to treat it with carbolic acid, and it was just too late. The person would die. What Lister discovered is if you wash the person's skin with carbolic acid and you wash your surgical instruments with carbolic acid and then you do the surgery, no one gets sick. Well, a lot fewer people get infections. Louis Pasteur at the time in Europe was doing research on beer and other things, fermentation, and he, along with Koch a few years later, figured out that it was bacteria causing contamination in beer and so on and so forth, and those results were, you could extrapolate those to humans. So within 15 years of the Civil War, we came to know that bacteria and viruses are what cause infectious diseases. 2 years after the Civil War ended, we learned how to prevent battlefield infection during operations. Syphilis was identified in 1905, but a lot of the bacteria that we talked about were identified in the early 1880s. So starting about 1880, people started to identify all these different bugs and what they caused. And so because of this, most historians would agree that had the Civil War started 10 years later, with the advances in medicine that happened during the 1860s, the death rate would have been a fraction of what it actually was. We'll never know that, of course, but that's what people think. I believe Listerine is named after this guy. Yeah, it's an antiseptic. It's for antisepsis. Sepsis is infection of your blood, right? So antisepsis is preventing infection of your blood, and that's what an aseptic is, and that's what Listerine is. So I'm pretty sure it's named after him. So, okay. So thank you for taking time out of your busy day to come listen to me talk and show you gruesome pictures. Um, Making this presentation, I took full liberty on the internet of ripping off every historical society that I came across for their pictures. So those are their pictures, not mine. And they'll never know I even used them, but I want to thank them for letting me use them against their will. So what time is it? We good? Okay. Yeah. That's a good question. I mean, he had a bullet wound that he lived with for a long time. Where was he shot? I don't remember. Did it go into his cranial cavity? Like, yeah. That would be, he may have survived, but he probably wouldn't have been Abraham Lincoln anymore with that kind of damage. Yeah. Yeah. So in the South, a lot more hot, a lot more humid. So the organisms that cause it do a little bit better there. But also, their organization wasn't what it was in the North. So no one did a good job of separating the latrine from the stream, but the North did it better. So you can read these accounts. It's amazing. Like, about these soldiers not even wanting their horse to drink from the water and the horse flat out refusing to, but they have to drink out of it if they want water. So just the environment of the South, along with the organizational problems they had, contribute to that. Because no one was getting cured of it, for the most part. Yes. Yeah. Yeah. So this is true of every single one of these diseases we talked about. Some of them have very small survival rates, but they all have a survival rate. It may be minuscule, but they all do. So you can, and there's people in the world who are still chronically infected with the malaria. So the malaria is inside your red blood cells, but that doesn't mean your immune system is going to not try to fight that. And so your immune system can keep things under control for a long time. It can never clear the organism, but it can keep the numbers of it under control enough that you may be asymptomatic for a long time. And then something that could happen, stress you out physically, whatever, and then your immune system drops a little bit, and then there it is all over again. That happens with HIV. Our immune system can just thrash HIV. It's really good at killing it, but it never kills it all. So the second it kind of lets up a little bit, boom, the virus is back. So. It's a protozoa. Yeah. Mosquito? Yeah, you kill the Anopheles and you kill malaria. That's why we don't get malaria here. So that's a question I don't know. You're going to have to ask an arthropod person about that. I know you have to, it doesn't live in anything but Anopheles, but I don't know the answer to that. It is? Thank you. Yeah, yeah. That's $1 million question. And the answer to that, this is my opinion, it's going to be really tough. And the reason it's really tough is this, is the generation time of a human is roughly 20 years. But bacteria in the right conditions can reproduce every 20 minutes. So the rate at which they can evolve, and respond to changes in their environment is much, much faster than we can. And so when we give this environment filled with antibiotics, the only ones that can live there are the ones who are resistant to them. So our life now is selecting for antibiotic-resistant bacteria. we use antibiotics too much. So one way to look at that is this. If you have a certain area, like this chair, doesn't matter, it could be anything, bacteria are going to be there. There's 10 times more bacteria in and on your body than there are human cells. You are mostly a carrier for bacteria, sorry. So no matter what the surface is or where it's located, there will be bacteria there. You will never get rid of them. The question is what kind are going to be there. And so the way it works in general is this. Bacteria that are sensitive to drugs tend to be simple. They don't have the mechanisms in place to make them resistant to drugs, but that makes them able to grow faster. So if there's no drugs around, then you're going to have bacteria that aren't resistant to drugs and bacteria that are competing for that space. And if there's no drugs, the bacteria that aren't resistant are going to win and crowd out the other ones because they reproduce faster. But if you add antibiotics to that environment, now you kill the ones that can divide fast but aren't antibiotic resistant, and the only body that can live there is antibiotic resistant bacteria, and so they make up the entire population. So if you look at this, we put antibiotics in the food for animals that we eat. What that's doing is making sure that the bacteria in that food and around those animals is bacteria resistant to the drugs, and they will be there regardless. And so then we eat that food, and now we have ingested bacteria that are resistant to those drugs. And over time, that cycle just continues, and so over time, our drugs are starting to fail. Now you look at the hospital, like for that Staph aureus, there's different types of it, and some are bad, but there's some drugs of last resort. One's methicillin, right? When methicillin won't kill Staphylococcus aureus, we're in big trouble. And if it can't, then we go to vancomycin. Vancomycin is the last drug that'll work against staph, and it has some bad side effects. And also, we now have Versa, which is vancomycin-resistant Staphylococcus aureus. So that last drug doesn't work now. And so what's going to happen in the future for that is anyone's guess. These didn't show up until the 30s, and when they came in, they were heralded as changing the world completely. Infectious diseases gone forever, but the bacteria evolve. And so as we put drugs in the environment, the only ones that can live in that environment are the ones that can survive the drugs. So all the bacteria in the environment after time are ones that live in the drugs just fine. So that's a good question. And if you look at the numbers of antibiotics that have been produced, like in the last 15 years, there's virtually none. There's a few problems with that. One, there's no money in it. If you make an antibiotic, you give it to someone for a week, and they're cured, and you're not going to get paid anymore. But if you can make a drug that someone has to take every single day for the rest of their life, that's the moneymaker. So that's where the focus tends to be for biotech companies. That's a whole different rant. So we'll see where that goes. But it's a scary, scary question. Because when you look at these pictures, the only thing between us and them is antibiotics. That's it.
Are some of the new antibiotics coming from plants and organisms like out of the rainforest and such?
Yeah, what they do when they're looking for them, there's actually warehouses, giant warehouses filled with nothing but samples of everything under the sun from all over the world. And so what people do is grow up a bunch of bacteria, take 100 samples of God knows what, and see if it inhibits the bacterial growth. If it does, next step is to see if it's safe for humans. And then if it can pass all these different criteria, then it'll be used as a drug. But absolutely, people look everywhere. And then once you find it, then what you do is you have an organic chemist make the active compound in a lab. Like that quinine I told you about, very effective at killing malaria. It causes the accumulation of a toxic compound inside the parasite and kills it. And it used to be purified from a tree that grows in Peru. And so when Peru discovered that they have the tree that cures malaria, they outlawed the export of seeds or saplings of that tree. And then the Dutch went and stole it anyway and started their own plantation. So it spread around the world. But for a while, they had the monopoly on that drug. But then what happened is an organic chemist found the active ingredient, synthesized it in a lab, and you don't even need the tree anymore. So you guys are getting fidgety. Is it time to go home and have dinner? Yeah. So thank you for coming. So.